So, in one of my community college classes where I was giving a talk on Buddhism, the question came up, which is an interesting one. One of the students asked, "Is there anything you struggle with when following the ways of Buddhism?" And of course, this comes from somebody who really had, prior to my lecture to the class, no knowledge about Buddhism. Just as a side point, they also ask, when a person passes away, do you burn paper items such as paper houses, phones, food, jewelry, etc., to, quote, give that person those items in the afterlife? And asks, do you set out food for the dead? Regarding that last series of questions, I have to plead ignorance because honestly, I don't know that much about the rituals associated with Buddhism. I don't live around a temple and I haven't been brought up in the faith. And so I would have to defer any of those kinds of questions, as well as questions about holidays, to folks who are much more knowledgeable and practicing on a day-to-day basis in terms of the wider Sangha rituals and holidays, more so than I myself. I've started to get a little bit more involved in that with my association with a temple out in Los Angeles, but again, I judge myself to be quite ignorant as regards those kinds of matters. But back to the original question, is there anything you struggle with when following the ways of Buddhism? When I thought about this one, at one level, there's nothing that I struggle with because I'm very happy and settled within my own sense of feeling of confidence that from among the various religions in the world, while many have strengths and many have weaknesses, my judgment that Buddhism was, for me, the one that made the most sense and that felt most resonant with my spiritual experience, I'm totally satisfied with that. And further, with respect to my belief in the Shin Buddhist doctrine of Shinran Shonin, again, I'm 95% comfortable with that. I do have faith in the power of Amida's vow. There might be some very minor points that I still struggle with a little bit in terms of the doctrine as explicated by Shinran, but that's relatively minor. What I would point to in a more substantive way when I think about struggles is that, and again, these aren't sources of great distress, but, the issue of sectarianism. So I know within Buddhism, we talk about the fact that there are 84,000 teachings. And of course, there are many, many sects within Buddhism. And as I frankly told the students at one point, in terms of the teachings of Buddhism, the whole Tripitaka is, I don't know, maybe 100 books with 1,000 pages each. So needless to say, there's plenty of opportunity for both minor and major divergences, many of which have led to other sects or schools within the tradition. And that's fine. I have no problem with that, particularly from the standpoint of the skillful means notion, based on the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, that, again, different people, different personalities, different spiritual needs require different kinds of approaches and teachings. And I think that's fine. I personally think that in some sense they all lead to the Mahayana, and that the Mahayana leads to Amida Buddha and faith in his vow. But, that's my sectarianism, and so I plead guilty in that regard. But to my mind, it's unfortunate when sectarianism leads to antipathy or conflict or negative judgments by one school or sect relative to another. And again, not that there can't be scholarly or intellectual or spiritual religious debates and discussions, interfaith kinds of discussions, if you will. But again, to the extent that those turn hostile, that's not a good thing. And there are some examples of that within Buddhism. And by the way, these notions of things that I, quote, struggle with are not applicable to within Buddhism only, but applicable also to within religion generally. And of course, in the broader field of religion, there are many different religions, many different schools within various religions, and many situations and circumstances over the course of history when those differences have resulted in not just sort of hypercritical commentaries, but in actual outright oppression or wars or hostile behavior of various kinds. And that, to my mind, is not good. So sectarianism is an issue. And then fundamentalism is another issue. A friend of mine who was a Baha'i, who I think I've mentioned before, he and I came to a mutual agreement that religion can be very good for people and for the human race, but where it particularly becomes problematic is within any particular religious tradition, or again, in Buddhism, within any particular school or sect, that the feeling gets established that, by gosh, my sect is the best, and anybody who doesn't believe in this is going to hell or is absolutely wrong-headed. In other words, it's kind of an extension of that first comment that I made about sectarianism, except again to a more extreme degree, where again it's like my system is right and everybody else is absolutely wrong. And frankly, the fact that they are wrong means that their destiny is going to be towards some very unpleasant outcome. I think that's the source of a lot of the problems within religion generally, and again is something that we do see from time to time within the Buddhist tradition, unfortunately. And then the third thing I'll mention that in some ways is kind of a softer kind of, I won't say concern, but thing that I become aware of from time to time is sort of historical revisionism. And, that would be where a particular sect shapes their history and the history of the lineage of the masters, the Dharma masters that have come before, in order to, I won't say rationalize, but explain the basis upon which that particular sect has come to its doctrinal conclusions. In other words, using historical facts and modifying them, if you will, such that they become more mythological in the service of supporting a particular school or sect in the present day. Now, I'll give one example of that, which I think is, again, pretty mild but pretty pervasive, which is that, the question of, for example, who taught the Mahayana sutras, the scriptures. And, there are some who realize the historicity, if that's a word, to the extent that they realize these were written in the era of, say, 100 to 300 in the Common Era. And, obviously were not written by Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, even though in all of them, in order to establish a certain kind of credibility, they portray these sutras as having been preached by Shakyamuni. So, the question is, did he preach them himself personally? And, some Buddhists say, yes, that's definitely the case. Others would say that, well, no, that was kind of a device to help, again, establish a greater credibility for those particular scriptures. I'm glad for anybody else's comments on this, but again, I don't think it's a super big deal because, the way of analyzing and thinking about these things from my point of view that can help reconcile the issue is to realize that Shakyamuni, he didn't write down all of his theories and ideas and scriptural insights into written form. He didn't write them down because they didn't write at that time. It was an oral tradition, is my understanding. And again, you have to look at what Sakyamuni's behavior actually was when he went out and preached and helped people with their suffering. So, just as the early Buddhists, the people of the Theravadan school and others of the Nikaya kind of tradition got together and put in written form what they had understood Shakyamuni as having said verbally, and did the best they could at doing that. In a similar fashion, you can argue that the Mahayana folks and the Mahayana followers to this day are following teachings and truths that they felt were reflected in the fundamental meaning of Shakyamuni's message, not again through written kinds of communications, but through his actual behavior and conduct in the world. which is a model for us even now in the 21st century. So those are just some things. I'm happy to hear any other comments that anybody wants to share in the comment section regarding issues that you struggle with in terms of Buddhism. But again, it's minimal to my mind. Well, I'll mention one more, and this is at the risk of sounding a little political. And again, it's tied in certainly with the some of the issues that I talked about in terms of sectarianism. Is unfortunately Buddhism is not immune from having some people who purport to be Buddhists manifest violent behavior toward other groups or individuals. And of course, the major example of this right now is in Myanmar. And I think what Buddhists are doing there, I don't know the details of it. I don't follow the news on that front super closely, but I do hear enough and read enough to know that that what's being done to the Muslim population there is totally unconscionable. And to the extent that that's being done in the name of Buddhism, I think it's a gross misinterpretation and misunderstanding of the message of the Buddha, which was wisdom and compassion toward others, regardless of the extent to which they are similar or not similar to ourselves in belief, ethnicity, or any other dimension that we can think of. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.